Okay, session 2. Again, we are with Mr. Wahid Azal, scholar of Bayani and the Babi history, and he's also, educated in philosophy and history of religion. Those who have followed us so far may well know it that, Bayanis have gone through numerous fightings, murders and pillage, from the very beginning of the core of the primal point, to the new faith called Bayan. When the point, was imprisoned, the insurrection of Tabarsi and Zanjan took place, and a little while afterwards, the mass murder of the Bayanis happened in Tehran in 1268. Is it right, Mr. Azal? 1268, just 2 years after the point's martyrdom. And the lives of the followers of the Bayani faith were perpetually in danger accordingly. Torture and assassination of the Bayanis occurred in abundance for many years. My first question for you is, would you please briefly explain what happened that led to the execution of the primal point, and from there to the uprising in Neiris, in Tabarsi and Zanjan?
Bismillah al-Amna il-Aqdas, in the name of God, the impregnable, the most holy. I'll start here. The insurrections, we have 3 insurrections. We have the insurrection of Sheikh Tabarsi in Mazandaran. We have the insurrection in Neiris 2 years later, and also Zanjan that were pretty much contemporaneous. Neiris and Zanjan are uprisings that occur within the year that the primal point is martyred in Tabriz. But first, let me start here. I mean, recently, as many know, I follow the weekly podcasts of the Iranian scholar Hassan Ershad, who goes by the moniker of Nasiruddin. Hassan Ershad is a very good scholar. I think his critiques are very well taken. He is very good at what he's doing. However, Hassan Ershad is perpetuating a very skewed and very biased Hawzavi narrative about early Bābism that is not that it doesn't jive with actual historical fact. Now, recently, for example, he has been comparing the Babis to Daesh, and this comparison could not be more further off.
That's absurd. Is that not?
It's completely nonsense. First of all, the Daeshis are Wahhabi Salafists. They exhibit more the traits of the early Khawarij that murdered Imam Ali alayhi salam.
Exactly.
The Babis are a completely different kettle of fish. I mean, in his last podcast, especially, he tried to characterize, for example, the Qayyim al-Asma that we talked about in the last podcast as being a political manifesto with absolutely no religious or spiritual content. Well, anybody who's actually studied this text in depth knows that not only is that not the case, but there's all kinds of pericopes and quotations within the text of the Qayyim al-Asma to very serious esoteric and mystical tropes within the writings of the Imams. Sure, the Bab calls to arms, but
by the way, Mr. Azal, as you alluded, in the previous podcast, we could probably say the tenet of the teachings of the point was to abrogate any sort of political leadership backed up by religious authority.
Yes and
no.
Is
that true?
This is a yes and no. The Bāb did not... the Baha'is have characterized the Bāb in their own writings as someone who wanted to completely do away with the entire ecclesiastical establishment as a principle, right? But that is not true. Whether you read the Bayan or then later the Book of the Five Grades, Kitab al-Panj Sha'an, the Bāb actually conceived of a very elaborate system of a Bayani ecclesiastical order, at the top of the hierarchy of which was the mirror, who acts pretty much as a pontiff, but an inspired pontiff, an imam. So the Bāb was conceiving a structure for his community that, if you wanted to compare it to something, is very similar to the Ismaili hierarchies that existed in the medieval period, especially the Fatimids and then later the Nizaris of Iran themselves.
So let us concede that the primal point, identified as an imam. Okay, back to the point. Why the point was in prison in Maku and later in Chihrīq, as you said. His fiery missionaries, were busy traveling all around Iran, calling upon the Shiites to accept, his invitation as their long-expected Mahdi.
Sure.
In the meantime, a number of Babi leaders had gathered in a place called Badasht, near Shahrut, a city after a central city, in Iran. And, in Badasht, something happened, which is worth debating. Qurrat al-Ain, that you also briefly talked about her. Qurrat al-Ain was the only woman included among the letters. She was, learned, cultivated, and eloquent, and on becoming a disciple of the point, whom she had never seen. She gave herself, unreservedly and wholeheartedly to the advancement of the cause. The Babi historian Mirza Jani Kashani, starting his own opinion and probably that of other Babis also, says that the Bab, is master of all men and women and has the authority, to interchange anything, including will, people's will, probably indicating that he thought, the Bab himself had united Qurrat al-Ain, with Her Holiness Fatima Zahra. She was considered the return of Fatima Zahra. At Badasht, in the spring of 1848, while the point was still in Maku, something happened, as I said. However, things were said and done, which caused even some of the Babis to stumble, as they say, and they took their departure. Those who remained seem to have been, totally devoted to the Muqtadi teachings, and they brought down on them the wrath of the people, of the village intoxicated by, the slogans of the mullahs. It was at Badasht that Mirza Hossein Ali received the title Baha, which means splendor, given him according to Avare, or Abdul Hossein Ayati, the historian, by Qurrat al-Ain, or possibly by the other Babi leaders. It was not bestowed. Sorry, it was certainly not bestowed by the point, who was the sole grantor of titles.
Exactly.
After the conference, Qurrat al-Ain met the young Mirza Yahya'i Subh-i-Azal, brother of Baha, who had not been at Badasht, of course, and took him with her to Nur. So, what's your take on my brief review of what happened in Badasht,
well,
and after they present the double?
This information is confirmed by Ezia Khanum in her Tanbih al-Na'imin. That the title Baha was actually granted by Qur'at al-Ain to Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri. And the reason for that, she explains, is because Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri had actually paid for the lodging and the proceedings on the plains of Badasht. And he had felt slighted somehow because some of the other assembled Babi leaders, chief of two among whom were Quddus and Qur'at al-Ain, had received titles, and he hadn't received any titles. And he felt like a junior member of this assemblage, even though he was an aristocrat and et cetera, and he had paid for all of this. So Ezia Khanum characterizes that because of his hurt feelings, Qurrat al-Ain actually bequeathed her own title that she had gotten from the Bab to Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri. Now, as to what actually occurred in Badasht, the accounts are multiple. Haji Mirza Jani Kashani in Kitab al-Nuqtat al-Kaf, mentions that he uses a play on words. He calls Badasht, the plane of innovation, where all kinds of claims and events were going on that were explicitly flouting, at least the exoteric element of the Sharia itself, with Tahira Qurrat al-Ain. And this is also based on the testimony of Abbas Afandi Abdul Baha himself, making declarations about her divinity, making claims.
What were the provisions of Badasht? Simply and plainly.
The provisions of Badasht were basically to proclaim the separation of the people of the Bayan, in the sense. So this is how I have characterized it, as a sort of Babi dramaturgy of Alamut. Almost exactly. A very similar thing had happened in 1164, actually not too far away from where Badasht is, another province of Iran, obviously, but where the assembled Babi leadership, based on the revelation of the two bayans, the Arabic and the Persian bayans, and the correspondences and letters and epistles that the primal point had been sending from that point forward, made their proclamation of the end of the exoteric Islamic dispensation in the beginning of the age of truth, and inner truth. However, the fact of the matter is the Bab had actually replaced, he didn't completely do away with these outward forms of the Islamic Sharia and leave nothing in its place. He had actually replaced it, from the calendar to the form of prayer, to the greeting, etc., etc. So, but nevertheless, the way that this played out in Badasht was very similar to the way that it had played out in Alamut several centuries before. And this shocked the assemblage, some of whom were not under the impression at the time that the Bab had made a claim to Mahdihood and the Qa'im, the position of the Qa'im. So they basically walked out of the proceedings, and this was one of the biggest schisms that the Babis had experienced up to that point. There are stories that certain people had slit their throats, etc. There are these embellishments that Qurrat al-Ain had come into the assemblage of men without her veil on. There's not that much supporting evidence for that. Haji Mirza Jani certainly doesn't mention that.
That's right.
But it was more to do with the fact of what they had proclaimed. And at first, apparently, Quddus, Mullah Ali Muhammad al-Barfushi, had actually resisted this radical public break, although this had been already building for quite some time within the greater Babi leadership, and they all were well aware of where the Bab was taking this. But they were, Quddus was somewhat reluctant. Nevertheless, he was persuaded by Qurrat al-Ain herself to endorse this public break with the exoteric, let me underscore this, with the exoteric dispensation of Islam itself. And this is, like I said, this is something that has occurred many times throughout Islamic history. But from the point of view, I would say, of a dramaturgy, and from the point of view of, I think, of an event that we can mark on the calendar, this event itself punctuates the moment where the Bayani community literally comes into its birth publicly, following the revelations of the two Bayans and the epistles and writings following that.
Right. Because afterwards the Babis, according to the history again, moved into Mazandaran, with the full intention of getting control of that province,
That's right.
The time was kind of propitious and, messy, for on September 4, 1848, Muhammad Shah had died.
Yes.
And the new king, Nasruddin Shah, had not yet, ascended the throne.
He was still on his way from Tabriz to Tehran at the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there was no one prepared, to oppose, the religion of Bayan strongly. More than 300, strong. They entered Barfush armed, thus provoking, strife. They were soon attacked by, the bigoted, brainwashed Muslims, and several of them were, brutally killed. Then the Babis began to fight, and it was a very courageous resistance,
Yes.
according to the historians, and the government did not expect, whatsoever one such retaliation.
Before we get to that, let's first of all underscore the following. This is attested by not just Babi sources or even Baha'i sources, but it's also attested by Qajar chronicle history like Sefer's Nasr al-Tabariq, that the Babis were actually attacked first. And this occurred right at the tail end of the conference of Badasht itself, where they were attacked by the villagers. Most sources say that they were incited to attack these Babis assembled there. And then on the route of these Babis, especially the forces under the commands of Quddus and Mullah Hussein Bushri jointly, or when they met up in Mashhad, they were constantly attacked on the way. They were being accosted, harassed. So the initial, this is what a lot of people don't know. Quddus and then later on Mullah Hussein's original intention was to take their people and go to the Atabat, go to Karbala. They had no intention of alighting in Mazandaran and Sheikh Tabriz. It just so happened that they were accosted by local forces, local militias, and then later on government forces. And
they were lured. They were lured in fighting.
They were lured. So they ended up at the shrine at the shrine.
Because Mr. Azal, sorry, let me comment. Mullah Hussein, as you said, the first to believe on the primal point, he said, notwithstanding his slender and fragile frame and trembling hand, he attacked, the invaders,
yes.
who had killed the first Babis,
Sure.
One of the Babis who was taken by the town folk was buried alive, by them in a well. Mm-hmm. After, a pitched battle of several days duration, during Barfush, the Babis were allowed to retire.
Yes.
Later in another mission, Babis came off victorious again, after which they moved to a shrine in the forest called Tabarsi. Here they strongly, entrenched themselves, hoping to make this position the base for the consequent of Mazandaran. Many people had now joined them, and their numbers reached around 2,000. Mm-hmm. They carried on, an active campaign of preaching from the fort, telling the people that the point was shortly to become, the master, and, bidding them accept him at once. Crowds assembled about the fort, some of whom entered and united with the Babis. Gobineau, the historian, relying probably, on information given him by Muslim historian, that says, exactly, that within the fort of the Babis divided the world among themselves, apportioning various ones the wealth of India, China, and Europe. He says also that the Babis looked upon, Mullah Hussein as God, and, prostrated themselves in his presence, which seems to be quite absurd again, that he in turn told his, principal officers that they were the return of various imams, and assured them that if they were killed, they would, after 40 days, come back to earth again. This all come from, Gobineau, who borrowed the materials from, a Muslim scholar. Again,
well, I mean, a lot of this is confirmed. I mean, one of the most reliable histories of Sheikh Tabarsi is the Wahid Mimiyeh. And the Wahid Mimiyeh, by Muhammad Hussein Mahjour, confirms a lot of this information. But, you have to contextualize this correctly. This is a millenarian, eschatological, messianic movement. There's no question about that. That this is what it is. And in the very same context that you had very similar things occur during the medieval period of Islam with the various Ismaili groups, whether we're talking about the Karmatians or whether we're talking about the Nizaris or even the Fatimids themselves, you have to rely on this element of Islamic history to make this comparison, or even the Hurufi movement, which was active about 4 centuries before the Babis. So, going back to, the accusations about, these are like Daeshis, etc. This is, the people who don't know their history correctly or are talking from a place of bias make these sorts of comparisons to local, to contemporary events like this. The fact of the matter is that, it wasn't as if these villagers or the government troops, etc., were completely innocent. They were accosting these Babis. Now, yes, these Babis were very hot-headed, as you would expect, and they were preaching, openly that the Imam had arrived, that this was the age of inner truth, and that, their notions even of what the resurrection is, and this is where the entire botany legacy of Iranian Islam that Henry Corbin wrote so copiously about is very important to contextualize what was going on in the minds of these people. They believed that the resurrection, the Yawm al-Qiyamah, the day of resurrection was going on. And, if you're a Bayani believer, you believe the same thing. I believe that this is what happened, but not in the sense of a literal apocalypse, a literal, Nevertheless, a movement has come into being, and it is attempting to expand itself. And then it is faced with fierce first, minimal opposition, then eventually fierce and violent opposition by the entrenched forces of that area. Now, I want to respond to something else that is a very crucial point to contextualizing this. A lot of Muslim detractors of Bābism like to characterize these events during those 6 years of the Babi movement as a kind of a sui generis eruption of messianic insanity. Well, and the Qajar state was not to blame, and the ulama were completely blameless, etc. This is not completely true. We have all kinds of problems in Iran, even prior to the revelation of the Bayan itself. Only 2 years before the declaration of the Bab in Shiraz, Agha Khan Mahallati, the Agha Khan, the preeminent leader of the Nizari Ismaili sect, revolted against the Qajar state. At that time, Muhammad Shah was still king, And this was a very bloody insurrection, and they were basically run out of Iran and into India. And this is the reason why the Nizari Ismaili community now, their headquarters are now in India, is precisely because of the reaction of the Qajar state and also the Usuli Mujtahids, especially against Aga Khan Muhammad.
So it is therefore not surprising. It is therefore not surprising that this strange, and aggressive movement was feared by the rulers, as well as by the bigoted populace.
The Qajar state, at that time was not completely secure. Now, there was that period, the golden age of the Qajar was probably under Fath Ali Shah Qajar. On the death of Fath Ali Shah Qajar, his own nominated successor is shunted aside and dies, Abbas Mirza. And then once Muhammad Shah ascends the throne, he proceeds to kill all of the loyalists of Abbas Mirza, like the Farahani family, for example, which incidentally is precisely the family that Amir Kabir himself came from. So, you have these fratricidal and wars happening within the Qajars themselves. The state was far from centralized, far from secure. It had only been 100 and something years before the Nadir Shah had actually run out the Shiite ulama out of Iran completely. And it was under basically the tail end of the Zands that these Mujtahid, these Usuli Mujtahid, started to trickle back into Iran. And then under Muhammad Khan Qajar, where he basically invited them completely to come back to Iran. And the first thing these Usuli Mujtahids did was to turn against the Sufis. So there was massive Sufi Koshi, Sufi killing happening. You had these Mushtaq Ali Shah, one of the Aqtab, one of the preeminent leaders of the Ni'matullahi order, who was martyred in Kerman because he was making the call to prayer, the azan, on a sitar. For example, these sorts of things. And just bracket that for a minute. If they want to, if these more Hosavi conservative types want to blame the Babis as some kind of a sui generis explosion of heterodoxy, they only need to look back into the history of Iran only a few decades before, where you had Ni'matullahi. so this conflict.
Let's
sure.
So let's carry Mr. Azal. Let's carry on because I'm gonna spur you another explanation. As an organized force sent by government against the Babis, which had occupied, was defeated by them in a night attack. The village was sacked, and 130 soldiers, were killed. Then a large force under the command of Prince Mehdi Mirza was sent from Tehran, by the new prime minister, with strict orders to destroy the Babis. The prince wrote a letter to Mullah Muhammad Ali, aka Quddus, asking what he was fighting for. Quddus replied, quote, "As for thee, O prince, let not the woe and the presumption of youth lure thee. Know that Nasruddin Shah is a false king, and his helpers shall be chastised in God's fire. We are the king of truth, who seek after the good pleasure of God." Unquote. The royal forces, under the command of the prince, drew near the fort, but before they were able, to attack it, the Babi leaders, choosing a time when, the enemy were off their guard, because of severe, snowstorm. However, this time also, their attack met with complete success. Kind of double-crossed them. The royal army was again routed. But the Babis suffered, an irreparable loss, for their commander was killed,
Mullah Hussein.
Mullah Hussein, Bab, entitled Bab, and the strongest of the Babi leaders was Muhammad, just in the hour of victory. He died, in his saddle as his horse entered the gate of the fort. It is said that he, before, his death, commanded his officers to be firm in their faith and promised them that he would return, to earth in Qiyamah. He bade his intimate friends to bury him secretly, fearing that, the Muslims might find and mutilate his body. So when Mullah Muhammad Ali, was questioned as to why he had raised this insurrection, he laid the blame on Mullah Hussein, and it is said that he even cursed Mullah Hussein. That's again.
I don't.
It is tragic.
I don't.
Sorry, because
are you saying that Quddus blamed Mullah Hussein Bushri for the insurrection at Sheikh Tabarsi?
Yes, and I said that's a blatant lie because it was quoted. It was quoted from a Qajari source.
These are regular biases that you find in some of these Qajar sources. I mean, let's go back to Rivalry.
It's because as you know, yes, because in tragic conflict, most of the 18 letters of the living perished. Is that right? Yep. Unfortunately, thus after 9 months of fighting, the first and most brilliant attempt of the Babis to establish the resistance came to an end. According, to the Muslim historian, 500 of Shah's soldiers and 1,500 Babis
perished,
lost their lives in this, conflict. So, but soon, according to Mirza Jani again, Mirza Hussein Ali, aka Baha, fell under suspicion, and it was said that he not improbably, harbored designs of setting up a standard, on his own account, and so creating further disturbances in those regions. Therefore, the notables of the district, the local officials considered it expedient to send him to the capital. How different the later history of the Babi movement would have been had, had these 3 men been able, to reach Sheikh Tabarsi as they wished to do, and perished, with Mullah Hussein and Mullah Muhammad Ali and the rest of, the garrison.
Well,
1 year after, this...
the account that we have from Nuqtatul Qaf, and also other personal accounts, is that Subh-i-Azal had attempted from Tehran to go to Sheikh Tabarsi, was apprehended on the way, brought back to Tehran. Then they started out again, this time with Baha and a bunch of other people, but they were apprehended outside of Amman, right? So they never made it anywhere close to Qa'im Shar, where Sheikh Tabarsi is today located. And first they were apprehended, but then they were let go. There was Baha'ullah was apparently bastinadoed. He was what they called the falak. He was beat on the foot. First it was meant for Ṣubḥ-i-Azal. The Baha'ullah took the blow for his younger brother, and then they were sent packing back to Tehran. Apparently, as they came back and settled back in Tehran, Sayyid Yahya'i Darabi had come through Tehran and with the mind of actually making it to Sheikh Tabarsi. This is about a month before the fort actually falls, and Baha had basically dissuaded him from going, especially since the government had barricaded and closed all the roads leading to Qa'im Shah or Sheikh Tabarsi. Whether Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri would have been able to set up a standard of his own, well, frankly, Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri did not possess the charisma at the time, to be able to contend with a character and a personage of the caliber of either a Mullah Hussein or a Quddus, let alone a Tahiri. I mean, just remember, if the account of Izzi Khanum, the great aunt, is to even be critically taken on face value, then Mirza Hussain Ali had a tantrum because he was being ignored at Badasht, and it's because of this that Qurrat al-Ain had even given her title to him. So whether he would have been able to set up a standard of his own as Sheikh Tabarsi, well, it's obvious that no one would have paid any attention to the guy, particularly because he was basically a nobody in the greater scheme of the Babis of the time, despite what the later Baha'i sources say, such as Nabil Zarandi, or the pseudo-Zarandi as I call it, or some of these tablets and writings of Abbas Effendi that elevated the position of his father ex post facto. But Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri was a nobody, and in fact, some of the observations the later Bayani sources and even non-Bayani sources, Muslim sources make, is that the elimination of the Babi leadership, and particularly Quddus, Mullah Hussain, and obviously the Bab himself, and then later on Qurrat al-Ain, was a gift from heaven to Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri, because then his path, first of all, via his brother, his younger brother, the legitimate successor of the private one, would have been, is now easy once this leadership, initially of these preeminent letters of the living, is gone. Now let me address something here, because Mr. Hassan Ershad has been repeating this in many of his programs. Mr. Hassan Ershad keeps repeating this narrative about the appointment of Subh-i-Azal that is completely ahistorical and originates in the Baha'i sources beginning in 1867 with Baha'ullah's Kitab al-Badi. And this is what I call the scarecrow theory of the appointment of Subh-i-Azal that the Baha'is have pushed since Mirza Hussain Ali made this claim. The theory goes something like this, that the Bab, in order to protect Baha'u'llah, appointed his younger brother as the preeminent leader of the Babis and his successor. Yet, there is not a shred of documentation or evidence anywhere prior to 1867 that this is what actually happened. In fact, all of the documentation that we have of Baha'u'llah's own reaction to the nomination of Subh-i-Azal in 1849, when this succession was made official, was that it was a negative one. Let me give you an example. There are several accounts from Bayanis, and these are family members of Baha'u'llah himself, that say that they were in Tehran when the Bab's first epistle, and there's a number of epistles, not just one epistle, arrived, nominating Subh-i-Azal as his successor. And his first reaction...
Yes.
And his first reaction was that Yahya does not deserve such accolades. He was upset. This is attested by Ahmed. This is repeated by, I believe it's repeated by Naraghi and also Siraj and Qahir. I'm not completely sure at the moment. But Ahmed, Khanum certainly says that is the case. And other sources, Badiye Mirati Nuri, which is a later source. All of these sources repeat that Baha'u'llah's initial reaction to the fact that his younger brother had been made the successor and the mirror of the Bab was quite negative, and that he also had another tantrum again.
Okay. Mr. Azal, let's if you please, let's have a very really quick excursion, to the end of the faith of the point, because as you know, in the Mr. Azal, just a really quick excursion, to the story again, to finish with the story of the execution of the point. On July 8, 1815, you know, the Bab and Mirza Muhammad Ali, barefooted and clothed only in their underwear, you know, were led out to execution, you know. In the presence of a great crowd, Mirza Muhammad Ali, you know, was suspended by ropes from, you know, the parapet, and his body was riddled by the first volley of bullets, you know. Because before that, they were first taken to the house of 3 Muslim clerics, you know, from whom a sentence of execution for apostasy according to Islamic value was procured, you know. The 2 condemned prisoners were, you know, then dragged through the streets, you know, subjected to every sort of humiliation and treated most shamefully, you know. They were then led to the barracks in the citadel, you know, for the execution. It is very interesting. You know, then a second volley was fired by the same firing squad, you know, at the point, who was similarly suspended. When the smoke rolled away, a cry of mingled, you know, exultation and terror arose from the spectators, because the point had disappeared from sight. It seemed indeed that his life had been preserved by a miracle, you know, at the time, for the storm of bullets, you know, which had been aimed at him, not once had touched his body, you know. Instead of death, you know, they had brought him deliverance, you know, by cutting the ropes, which bound him so that he, you know, he fell to the ground unhurt. It is true, right? And
Yeah.
But as we know, the first firing squad, you know, were selected from Christians. You know, then they called upon, you know, another firing squad, you know, who succeeded in, you know, executing the primal point. But my question for you is, what became of the bodies of the 2 martyrs? Because according to some accounts, they were dragged through the streets, you know, and then thrown outside the city walls to be devoured, you know, by the dogs and wild beasts. But the Babi historian, Mirza Jani, writes again, quote, "The bodies of the 2 victims were exposed for 2 days, after which they were buried. Some of the Babis exhumed them, wrapped them in white silk, and according to the Bab's own instructions, brought them to His Holiness Subh-i-Azal, who, with his own hands, buried them in a certain spot. This matter is at present kept secret, and it is unlawful for anyone who has knowledge of it to divulge the information till such time as the Lord may see fit to make it known." These words were written not long after the death of the point.
That's right.
However, you know, the Baha'is, time and again, have been saying that, you know, Baha'ullah was fully aware of the spot, and, you know, he instructed to exhume, you know, the spot accordingly, you know, to survive the body and, you know, bring it to him. And finally, he ended up, you know, burying the remains of the point, you know, on the Mount Carmel.
Well,
what's your take on this?
My take on this is that this is a fable without much substance to it. When Subh-i-Azal buried the final remains of Anis and the private point, he was present and 2 other people were present. Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri Baha'ullah was not present at the time. We have the testimony of Subh-i-Azal himself in several places, one of which I actually posted on my blog not too long ago, that comes from a collection known as Muhajir al-Sadiq, which is a collection of tablets of Subh-i-Azal from the last decade of his life, and he gives a very detailed account of the whereabouts of Baha'ullah at the time. At the time, Baha'ullah was apparently engaged in some kind of financial dispute in Tehran itself, and his attention was elsewhere. So it was Subh-i-Azal and two other people who knew where the final remains were, and they buried them in an undisclosed location. Now, it is possible, because he says this in his communication to E.G. Brown, that one of these individuals may have disclosed that location, but this would have happened nearly 40, even close to 50 years after the fact, okay? Because contrary to the Baha'i claim, the final remains of the Point and Anis were not actually disinterred from Iran during the Baghdad period. They were disinterred, according, to probably sometime in the 1870s. So that would make it about 20 years after the execution of the Primal Point in Tabriz. And, memories can get quite hazy in a 20-year period, especially if the burial is happening in the dead of night in an undisclosed location, going through all kinds of procedures to conceal the final spot of this place. On top
do you stand by one of your writings that Professor Brown, wrote to Subh-i-Azal to get, his testimony, about what became of the Primal Point's body, and his replies was, Subh-i-Azal replied, it was like this: when the Primal Point was imprisoned in Chihrīq, he wrote to say that the place of Shah Abdul-Azim is a good land by reason of proximity of Wahid, which has the same, Subh-i-Azal, which has the same numerical equivalent as Yahya, the name of Subh-i-Azal for keeping. After the martyrdom of the Primal Point, his body was kept in the house of Suleiman Khan, who was brutally tortured and killed later on, and had the trust, the body conveyed to Tehran with the assistance of two believers. I was unwilling to keep that trust, in the prisons of Shah Abdul-Azim, as graves of the dead were daily ripped up and others were, interred in them. Therefore, I deposited it in a spot in the shrine of Imamzadeh Masum.
Yes.
Two persons had knowledge of the spot. After, the pretender, Baha'ullah, he called him as pretender, had set up his pretensions. He assigned certain persons to steal the trust, and the trust was stolen. And later on, paradoxically, the Baha'i accounts assert that Abdul Baha had the body brought to Akka back in 1899 and arranged, for its final interment in a beautiful, mausoleum on Mount Carmel near Haifa in 1910.
Well, here's where the narrative gets a little bit suspicious, and here let me tell you the reason why.
Sure, go ahead. Please.
If the body was disinterred from during the 1870s, there's a problem. If the body, or if the final resting place is found and disinterred in the 1890s, there's even a bigger problem, and this bigger problem is the following. First of all, the more time phases, the more time you have between the initial burial, and the disinterment, if it ever happened, is the person who gave this away, which there's big question marks about that, their memory would have been quite hazy. Now, during that time, the Dawlatabadi clan, and especially Hadiya Dawlatabadi, they were going between Tehran and Isfahan and the Atabad quite frequently, and there was quite a entrenched Yahya'i Azali network within Tehran itself that obviously would have been on the lookout in those environments of Tehran, right? So if they disinterred that body, they would have found out about it. You understand? And there are no Yahya'i, other than Subh-i-Azal's, statement to Brown that these people maybe broke the trust and disinterred the body. There is nothing else. And there is no evidence, even from the Baha'is themselves, despite the elaborate fables that they have woven about how they got the body out and it traveled from Iran to Palestine, that is actually the final remains of the primal point in Anis. That was deposited and interned and buried by Subh-i-Azal personally. So the Bayanis, by and large, do not believe the account at all of the Baha'is, and they do not believe at all that the final resting place of the primal point is actually on Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel. I've said this before, that shrine is a cenotaph. Badiya Mirati Nuri, in her review of Malak Khosravi's book, Iqlim al-Nur, makes the statement that she believes that the bodies that are actually buried in that shrine in Haifa, Israel, are number one, obviously, Abbas Effendi, Abdul Baha, but the body of Mirza Buzurg Nuri, because that body was in fact disinterred from Iran and taken to Karbala when the Nuri household left Iran. And in fact, the body, the final remains of Mirza Buzurg Nuri, were disinterred on the orders of Baha'ullah when they were ordered out of Baghdad. And it traveled with them through Edirne. And what she suggests very strongly is that the Baha'is have made up this fable where, in fact, it is not the Bab that is buried on that shrine in Mount Carmel. It is actually the final remains of Mirza Buzurg Nuri. Now, this matter can be very easily settled today with the kind of scientific and DNA medical research technology that exists. This matter can be settled once and for all. And especially since you have the survivors of both Baha'u'llah as well as the primal point still around. But of course, the Baha'is will never do that. And so the question marks hang over the very legitimacy, in my mind at least, and probably the majority of the Bayanis, that shrine is actually a fake.
Exactly, and that's what that's what we Bayanis legitimately ask the Baha'is to open up that disputed shrine on Mount Carmel, solely for doing some scientifically research, research, just to prove if the claimed body really belong to the primal point, in terms of, the latest achievements in DNA and forensic science. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I've made that clear, but then you have to also remember when the execution happened, what was actually left of the final remains of the primal point. I mean, whether we take Nabil's narrative, whether we take Haji Mirza Jani's narrative, there were a considerable number of gunmen that fired, and they use these old musket guns with these big pellet bullets that would rip anything to shreds. Now, Nabil claims about, what is it, 600 gunmen that fired in the Bab. If even half of that number were the ones that fired on the primal point, almost next to nothing of the body of either Anis or the primal point would have been left. The body, according to Haji Mirza Jani, was retrieved almost 24 hours after the execution. So, you then have the additional problem of, disfigurement of what was left. Anyway, what they managed to retrieve, they retrieve. Then they take this body from Tabriz, incognito, bring it to Tehran, bury it in Imamzada Masum, not too long after, in an undisclosed location. So, the questions of what actually was disinterred, is a question that any forensic scientist worthy of the name would want to know. And
exactly true. Because Mr. Azal, again, I must repeat my question. Would you please give me a very clear-cut answer, if you please?
Sure.
We Bayanis put forward a request. Is that legitimate, to you or not? That, we demand that the Baha'is opened up disputed shrine, of the Bab on Mount Carmel, just to be examined by experts in forensic science.
In fact, I was the first.
Is that legitimate or not?
Absolutely legitimate. I mean, I put this question out there in a list of demands back in 2007 to the Baha'i authorities, and I put it up on Usenet at the time. And the question still stands. But this needs to be done by independent forensic scientists, people whose both their reputation and their work is unimpeachable, that they're not going to be writing reports and analysis for one party or the other. That they have to, that they have to independently look at this evidence. But the thing is that this will not happen, and not only will it not happen for that reason, the Baha'is won't allow it to happen. It won't happen also because the Israelis won't allow it to happen. And they won't allow it to happen is because big money and shekel, tourism money, pours into Haifa every year.
Around $300 million.
If a huge question mark were ever to arise over the legitimacy of this shrine in the Baha'i Gardens of Haifa on Mount Carmel, this would damage the shekels and the money coming in to the Israeli tourism. And this is one of the reasons why, at this time at least, there is no, no matter what we say, they will never do something like that. But people
and surprisingly, so far they've just ignored, our demands. They ignored,
They have ignored the demands, and they will continue to ignore the demands. But just let me clarify something, and this is because of the nature of the hyphen Baha'i organization itself. Let's be clear that there are a multitude of Baha'i groups and grouplets and whatnot. We're talking about the parent hyphen Baha'i organization, or a cult, as I call it. This is a corporate organization. It is a corporate organization that embodies all of the principles of neoliberal capitalism in its worst form. And they operate and they think and they act in this exact same compact manner as any corporation does, right? And unless there is a power capable of making these people do certain things, they don't care. So we can sit here forever and put question marks over the legitimacy of the shrine on Mount Carmel, and nothing will ever happen. Okay? But
that's sort of Mr. Azal. We are going back, to this very, very important topic. But before that, I have a question for you.
Sure.
It's very important, in my opinion. Let's talk a little bit about the resurgency, of Subh-i-Azal,
Sure.
Because, first of all, did the primal point, the new manifestation, appointed any successor in naming his, resurgent? If the answer is yes, realizing the certainty, his, let's say, early death, because he was executed, in his early 30s, right? Mm-hmm. After the execution, of the prime point in Tabriz, Mirza Yahya Ṣubḥ-i-Azal became the recognized head of the people of Bayan, and it was accepted by the Babi community as their divinely ordained ruler, and continued in his position for some, 16 years. Sure. Mirza Yahya, the successor of, the primal point, was the son of Mirza Buzurg of the district of Nur, the province of Mazandaran, and it is also believed that he was, kind of brought up under the instruction of his older brother, Baha'ullah. It is interesting that the Baha'is claim, first of all, the authenticity of the primal point, explicit order, about the successorship of Subh-i-Azal. As second of all, they claim that volitionally and intentionally, the primal point, addressed Subh-i-Azal as a successor solely to save and spur his true and rightful successor, namely Baha'ullah. How would you examine this claim?
This claim is utter and complete categorical nonsense. Okay? And like I said before,
right,
there is not a shred of documentary evidence prior to 1867 where this thesis was ever advanced. First of all, let's look at it from this particular point of view. To claim that the primal point appointed Subh-i-Azal as his successor in order to shift attention away from Baha'u'llah makes the primal point quite a cruel figure, because Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri was quite an eminent, much older figure, okay, and basically the leader of the Nuri family at that point, effectively. Subh-i-Azal was the orphaned, younger stepbrother with no protection other than the protection of his older brother, Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri, and to focus danger on someone like him versus Baha'u'llah means that it is quite a cruel and calculative and manipulative kind of Bab that we're dealing with. But this is not the Bab of history. This is not the Bab of the Bayan. This is the Bab as conceived in the fertile imagination of Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri himself. Like I mentioned, there is not a shred of evidence for this theory at all. In fact,
and besides, Mr. It is well documented.
Let me finish. This
okay,
theory,
go on.
the origin of this theory begins in 1867, and especially with the Kitab al-Badi, which was a response by Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri to his detractors, and one particular one. And this theory has been repeated ever since, and it's been repeated even by people like Mazandaran, who quote some of these epistles of Baha'u'llah. However, the reason why the Bab appointed Subh-i-Azal as his successor has never been discussed in the Baha'i sources, and there's a reason for that, is because the communication, the first communication especially, by Subh-i-Azal written to Chihrīq still exists. There are copies of the very first piece of communication that Subh-i-Azal sent to Chihrīq. I have several versions of this, one copy of which is actually in the Harvard Qamar Taj Dawlad Abadi collection. And this is a moving epistle by this very young at the time, 17-year-old, 18-year-old, appealing to God, who is seated in degradation in Chihrīq. And anyone who reads this epistle cannot be moved to the depths of their soul at just the moving sincerity, the kind of the state of fana, if you would, that Subh-i-Azal was addressing the primal point in that epistle. And the immediate response by the primal point, by the Bab, also exists in multitude of manuscripts, where he basically, where Mirza Jani actually underscores what happened at the time, and also
exactly because Mirza Jani Qajani, he provides a very elaborate account of what was going on, because when Subh-i-Azal went to Mazandaran, and on the way he met and became acquainted with Quddus, and accompanied him to Barfrush, right?
Yep.
There he met Qurratul Ain. Both leaders showed him great kindness and attention, and at the command of Qudus Qurratul Ain, conducted Mirza Yahya to the Nur district,
Yep.
However, Mirza Jani, writes, quote, sometimes after this, Mirza Yahya sent a communication to the primal point in his prison in Chihrīq.
Yep, which I have actually now in front of me right
exactly.
now.
By the hand of Mirza Ali Sayyah. On reading which the primal point was overcome with joy. For, said he, the bayan has no borne fruit. From this saying, Mirza Yahya received the title, His Highness the Fruit, Hazrat Samari. At once, the primal point appointed Mirza Yahya as his successor, giving him the highest title, such as, Morning Eternity, Subh-i-Azal, Splendor of God, Baha'ullah, second point, Nuqtatul Thani, and the one, Wahid.
Yep.
It seems that the title Subh-i-Azal, by which, the primal point successor, is best known, was given him because he rose to prominence in the 5th year of, the primal point's manifestation.
Which is the 5th, if you trace it to the 5th theophanic sequence of the Hadith.
So what's all this coming? What's all this narratives coming that the primal point, intentionally and volitionally decided to...
Let's backtrack again.
Okay.
I mentioned in the last podcast, the first podcast, I mentioned that the Hadith Kumail, the Hadith al-Haqiqa, is one of, if not the, proof text narrative of Bābism, right? And this is proven not only in the Qayyim al-Asma, where there are echoes of the Hadith Kumail, but also in tracts like the Dalail al-Sab'a, the 7 proofs, where the primal point explicitly quotes it, and also tells his interlocutor about events that are about to unfold in reference to this 5th theophanic sequence, which is Nurun Ashraqa min Ṣubḥ-i-Azal fayaluhu ala hayakil tawhid athari, a light illuminating from the dawn of pre-eternity and shedding its traces upon the talismanic temples of unicity, right? This stanza of the Hadith Kumail is in reference in the mind of the Bab, in the theophanology of the primal point, to the emergence of Subh-i-Azal. The theophany of the person of Subh-i-Azal is embodied in the mind of the primal point, in the doctrine of the Bab, in the narrative of the Bayan, in the emergence of Subh-i-Azal upon the martyrdom of Qudus. Okay? And this is very important because Qudus as the preeminent letter, someone that the primal point even looked upon as his equal in many respects. And Haji Mirza Jani has this very interesting aside in the Kitab al-Nuqtat al-Qaf, where he mentions that during the time that Qudus was writing, the primal point was quiet and became the earth of volition, and Qudus became the heaven of the will. The very interesting Ismaili trope, where one becomes the natiq and the other one becomes the samit. One is the speaker, the other one the silent one. All of this was going on when Qudus was martyred in Barfurush, and this reached the ears of the primal point in Chihrīq. It was not long after this, and according to the narrative of Haji Mirza Jani, it was following a fever where the traces of holiness, of the return of Qudus in Subh-i-Azal were witnessed. So this is another very key element of the doctrine of who Subh-i-Azal was conceived to be in the mind of the Bab. And that is that Subh-i-Azal was specifically conceived in the mind of the Bab to be the return of Qudus.
And you just mentioned, a hadith let's get into that, because as you know, when Professor Brown visited Ṣubḥ-i-Azal in Cyprus back in 1896, Ṣubḥ-i-Azal showed him the original document, yes, written and sealed by the point himself. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. In which the point appointed Ṣubḥ-i-Azal as the successor. Brown published a copy of the transcript of the Arabic text, yeah, and translated as follows: quote, "God is most great with uttermost greatness."
Allahu Akbar, this is takbiran kabira.
Exactly. This is a letter on the part of God, the protector.
عند الله المهيمن القيوم إلى الله المهيمن القيوم.
The self-existent to God, the protector, and the self-existent. Quote again, say, all originate from God, all return unto God. Yeah. Please translate to Arabic.
Sure, let me get the text.
Yeah.
No. That's that. Let me get the text itself.
Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, let's continue. It says this is a letter from Ali before Nabil. Nabil is numerically equivalent to Muhammad, and Ali before Nabil is Ali Muhammad.
Yeah.
God's reminder unto the walls, unto him whose name is equivalent to the name of one Wahid, that's tantamount to 28 Yahya. Mm-hmm. Wahid is tantamount to 28, and 28 is tantamount to Yahya. The name of Ṣubḥ-i-Azal, God's reminder unto the walls. Say, verily all originate from the point of revelation. Unquote. O name of the One, keep what hath been revealed in the Bayan, and enjoin it, for verily thou art a mighty way of truth. Verily I am the proof of God and His light.
Yeah. الله أكبر تكبيرا كبيرا. هذا كتاب من إن الله المحيي من القيوم إلى الله المحيي من القيوم. قل كل من الله مبدعون كل إلى الله يعودون. هذا كتاب من علي قبل نبيل ذكر الله للعالمين إلى من يؤدل اسم الوحيد ذكر الله للعالمين. إن يا اسم الوحيد فأحفظ ما نزل في البيان وأمر به فإنك أنت للصراط الحق عظيم. إنني أنا حجة الله ونور.
And this is the testamentary. It is the testamentary.
It is one of
the position,
it
right?
is one of them. There's not just one. There is a whole.
Because there is another one. There is another one exactly as you said. Ṣubḥ-i-Azal was addressed by the point. The point says, "O name of eternity, bear witness that there is no God haunt me, the mighty, the beloved. God rules the place of the manifestation as He pleases."
I translated this document myself. Let me just get it out.
Okay.
Here we are. This is part of a larger tract, much larger tract.
Exactly.
إن يا اسم الأزل فأشهد على إنه لا إله إلا أنا العزيز المحبوب ثم أشهد على إنه لا إله إلا أنت المحيي من القيوم. O verily, O name of the pre-eternal, for I testify, or bear witness upon this, that verily there is no other God but I, the tremendous, the best beloved. Then I testify upon this, that verily there is no other God but Thee, the protector, the fearless. This is how this begins, and it is a couple of pages long. This is another of the famous tracts. Nicolas translated this into French. There's a translation of it into English, originally done by Jalal Azal. I translated it from scratch in 2004. Sefer Manu Chihrīq, a Baha'i scholar from Australia, translated, although his translation is quite inaccurate.
So, that was great, because so Mr. Azal, shall we conclude that the point's instruction to his holiday Subh-i-Azal for the period after his death, were as follows: first, to recite the point's verses.
Yes.
Second, to complete the bayan by writing the 8 sections or mahits.
Yep.
Wahid, which the point had left unwritten, due to, his sudden death, thus indicating, Azal's oneness with the point, Ananta wa Antana.
Mm-hmm.
Third, in case the time should not be, propitious, to complete the bayan, to preserve carefully what the point had written.
That's right. And
to preserve himself.
That's right.
Fourth, if a worthy person like himself should appear, to appoint him as a successor, otherwise he is to appoint witnesses. And leave the cause in the hands of the God. So Subh-i-Azal evidently did not consider the time propitious.
Mm-hmm.
So he did not complete the bayan.
That's actually not true. He did.
The Baha'i says, but he was completed bayan. Yes.
The Baha'is
Because after the point, he completed the bayan. And he also did appoint several witnesses, to assist him in the administration of the Babi cuts, one of whom was his brother, this very Mirza Hossein Ali.
No, Mirza Hossein Ali was not a witness. Was never appointed.
Oh, he was not a witness.
No, he was never appointed in any capacity in that respect. I actually wrote about this last year.
So do you know that for sure?
Absolutely, 100% positive. Baha'ullah was never appointed in any official capacity as a witness of the bayan. The names of the witnesses of the bayan in Baghdad, Karbala, Iran, and elsewhere, both of the first generation witnesses of the bayan and later are all known. Abu Wahid, Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani was a witness of the bayan. Mullah Muhammad Jafar Naraghi was a witness of the bayan. There's a paper on my Academia EDU page. It's called The Organizational Hierarchy of the Babis during the period of Subh-i-Azal's residency in Baghdad, where all of these witnesses of the bayan of both the first and second generation were named explicitly who these people were and who had appointed it. In fact, there is an epistle that Subh-i-Azal wrote immediately after leaving Iran and alighting almost immediately in Baghdad. He wrote this to 7 individuals in Iran, where he appointed these individuals as the witnesses of the bayan. This was the subject of my paper. The Baha'is seem to have a problem with the existence or the re-emergence of this epistle of Subh-i-Azal. However, the existence of this epistle and the fact that 7 individuals were appointed to the role as witnesses of the bayan is actually confirmed by a Baha'i writer, Mehdi al-Dahaji, who in his epistle or letter to E.G. Brown actually confirms this information and the existence of the Kitab al-Wasiyah, the book of the Testament by Subh-i-Azal, where these 7 individuals were appointed to the rank of or 8 individuals rather, were appointed to the rank of the witness of the bayan.
And Mr. Azal, as you know, in the pursuit of an unsuccessful attempt on the life of the Nasruddin Shah, as Gobineau accounted for, on September 15, 1852, the executions of the Bayanis were carried out. Each group trying, to outdo the others, in the barbarity with which they killed their unfortunate, Bayanis. An Austrian officer in the employ of the Iranian government was so horrified, by the unbelievable brutality of the scenes, which he witnessed, that, he resigned from his position. 28 Babis were, done to death. One of whom was the beautiful and gifted Her Holiness Murad, who had for some time been under arrest and could not have been implicated in the attempt, or, in any sort of attempt. And another one was Mirza Jani, the famous historian. Still another was Mullah Sheikh Ali Azim and Azim Turshi. Most of Mullah
Karim Qazvini, it's another one, who was a letter of the living.
Exactly, and most of the victims showed the greatest courage and devotion as they faced death, and their bold testimony won many new converts to their cause. From this time on, the Bayanis were more careful than ever, to conceal their faith, and were usually, ready to deny it, when their lives were in danger. This practice of dissimulation or taqiyya, was approved by, they say, by the leaders, as it had been previously approved, by the Shiites as well. But Subh-i-Azal managed to find his way, and made, his way to Baghdad,
That's right.
in Turkish territory. For he realized that he could no longer live in his native land. After 4 months, Baha was released from prison. It has been said, Mr. Azal, that in order to save his life, Baha denied everything. Even he denied the Prophet Muhammad.
Yes.
That
This is actually recorded by Hussein, by Abdul Hussein Ayati of Vare. Yeah.
Exactly, and that he denied that he was a Babi, a follower of a Bab, as the Bab has ordered his disciples to do at the time of his execution. This is not improbable, for it seems that those prisoners who were known, to the Babis were put to death, whether or not they were proved guilty of implication, in the plot, to kill the Shah. It appears the Russian.
That's right. Let's just remember that Baha'ullah's brother-in-law was a local employee at the Russian embassy. Now,
exactly.
What happened upon the assassination attempt on Nasruddin Shah was that immediately Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri went and took Badasht or refuge in the Russian embassy. This has been recorded by a multitude of historians. You barely hear about it in the Baha'i sources, of course.
That was exactly what I was going to say, because it appears that the Russian legation in Tehran helped to secure Baha's release.
That's right.
On a condition that he leave Iran.
Well, on the condition that he left Iran, he was handed then over to Agha Khan Nuri, who had by that point become the prime minister, because Amir Kabir had just been deposed and murdered by Nasruddin Shah. But yes, this was all brokered by the Russians. The Russians brokered the release of Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri out of Iran, and on the condition that he would be in exile and wouldn't return again, and that also that he gave up the family titles and estates, etc., which he did. Subh-i-Azal, at the time of the assassination attempt, had been in Nur, in Takur, in the village of Takur. He was not in Tehran. And upon hearing the news of this, basically escaped, donned the attire of a wandering dervish, and through the northern borders, through Kermanshah, etc., made his way to Baghdad. So Subh-i-Azal was the first member of the Nuri household to go to Baghdad, to go to Iraq. And he was followed by Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri Baha'ullah. Now the Baha'i sources make it out to be as if it was the other way around. And they use the fact that just prior to the assassination attempt on Nasr al-Din Shah, only a few months prior, Baha'u'llah had actually been in Iraq, had it been in Karbala, right? But they conflate these events and try to attempt to paint a picture that Baha'u'llah, escaped first and then Subh-i-Azal followed him.
Subh-i-Azal followed him.
That is not the case.
Is that true, Mr. Azal? Is that true that he arrived in Baghdad in April, 1853, where he joined, his brother Subh-i-Azal, and soon after, many other Babis, followed them to Baghdad in order to serve Subh-i-Azal, and from the beginning of 1853 till the spring of 1863, Baghdad was the seat of the resurgency of Subh-i-Azal, and the center, from which the secret Babi propaganda was carried on in Iran and Iraq. During this time, it is said by so many reliable sources and records of events that Baha was thoroughly at the disposal and the service of Subh-i-Azal. Is that right?
Absolutely. There is a multitude of sources from that period, including Baha'u'llah's own letters and epistles that luckily we have copies of that prove this. Look, let's go back to the letter. The only piece of communication that exists in the Bab's own hand written to Baha'u'llah, which was actually published in Qismati-Azal wa Khat al-Naqdi Ula wa Hussein Yazdi, portions of the writings of the Primal Point and Abu Hussein the Scribe. In this letter, the Primal Point, the Bab, basically instructs Baha'u'llah to take care of Subh-i-Azal till he dies, till Baha'u'llah himself dies, until his appointed time that he is to be the custodian and protector and guardian of Subh-i-Azal. This is from the Bab's own mouth. Now, the Baha'is can dispute whatever they like, but the fact is that we have the Bab's own handwriting for this letter. And moreover, within this letter, he addresses Baha'u'llah, not with the title, but with the abjad numerical value of Hussein Ali, okay, which is 238, right? So in the mind of the Babis, right, despite this entire rewrite of early Babi history by the Baha'is and the fertile imagination of Baha'u'llah himself in the late 1860s, and thereafter that, he was the real guy behind the scenes, the fact is that the Bab did not really consider Baha'u'llah somewhat of an eminent spiritual rank, maybe an eminent practical rank, because the man was effectively the head of the Nuri household. He was the eldest surviving son at the time of Mirza Buzurg Nuri, a courtier, etc., etc. So he would have respected Baha'u'llah on the practical level, but on the spiritual level that counted for the Bab more than anything else, it was his younger brother Subh-i-Azal, who was the preeminent leader of the community of the Bayan. Baha'u'llah was literally a nobody.
Exactly, and Mr. Azal, despite the lack of full accounts of the happenings of those 10 years, evidently Subh-i-Azal was looked upon by the Babi community as their supreme head.
Yes,
he was their supreme head, one in rank and authority, tantamount with the point himself. And Baha, however, was apparently not satisfied with the situation. He probably realized that the Babi cause, in order to survive, and to grow stronger, needed a different leadership than that of his brother Subh-i-Azal, revolved around peace. And he thought maybe he was able, to give it a better try. He was confident that he had the ability.
But see, here's the thing.
To supply this need.
Here's the thing.
And to comply this need.
Here's the thing. Baha'is, when you kind of pin them to the wall, will, occasionally say these sorts of things. If you believe that the Bab was divinely sent, then if you then even exceed the Bab may have appointed Subh-i-Azal, then the notion that perhaps Baha'ullah can offer a better leadership than Subh-i-Azal, or their attempt to try to craft Subh-i-Azal's leadership as a weak one, then becomes something else. Then this is not a decision by God. This is not a course of divine events. This is actually, people jockeying for power. And this is exactly what all of the detractors of Baha'u'llah from the Bayani side, these witnesses of the Bayan, like Qahir, Siraj, Mullah Muhammad, Naraqi, etc., these witnesses of the pin Baha'u'llah on, time and again, that, this guy was jockeying for power throughout the entire period in Baghdad, even because the primal point had given very specific instructions to Subh-i-Azal to conceal himself, right? Baha'u'llah took this to another level, and he would not even allow the witnesses of the Bayan to see Subh-i-Azal or have any kind of contact. Nobody other than Baha'u'llah and his immediate family had any contact with Subh-i-Azal during the entirety of that Baghdad period. Okay? Yet, during this time, as a lot of these accounts, for example, of Naraqi, as of Qahir Siraj attest, is that Baha'u'llah was also undermining Subh-i-Azal, even though publicly he was swearing fealty and what have you to Subh-i-Azal, to the high heavens. And a lot of these epistles, much of these letters, the accounts, the eyewitness report, these all exist. So, the attempt by the Baha'is to cast the situation in Baghdad in the terms that they have is complete, fiction. And it is basically their attempt to whitewash history, which so far they have successfully managed to do, especially given the fact that even in the Islamic Republic of Iran, when they're making these parodies of Bābism, they have recourse to the Baha'i narratives about Bābism rather than the actual, source narratives about
which
about
is
that
very
era.
Unfortunate.
Which is extremely
But,
unfortunate. And you hear this stuff also from someone as learned, a scholar as Hassan Irshad, where he is, regurgitating and parrot fashion, repeating the Baha'i narratives of Bābism, then there's a problem here. But the fact is that outwardly, Baha'u'llah paid 100% unequivocal obedience and obeisance to Subh-i-Azal. And there is no two ways about it.
That's a fact. And Mr. Azal, concerning what you brought up earlier on, that Baha was a calculative kind of person. He thought it was necessary, for a leader to have a divine appointment, on which to base his authority. Mm-hmm. The question is, did Baha have this sort of authority? He had received no authority whatsoever from the point, as you said. Yet he had a growing conviction that he was the new manifestation whose coming, the point had predicted. It is said that when...
Even that is questionable.
That is questionable.
Even that is questionable.
Because it is said, Mr. Azal, that when Baha was in Karbala, in Iraq, back in 1851, he met one day in the street Sheikh Hassan Zunusi, who was eagerly searching for the promised Imam Hussein, whereupon Baha confided to him, a secret that he was... actually the return of Imam Hussein, but forbade him to tell others. Also, it is said that after Baha's arrival in Baghdad, 2 years later, he disclosed secretly to his friend Mirza Rajan, Khadamullah, known as Qadamullah, a glimpse, of the, as yet years later, he disclosed secretly, to others. It seems therefore that Baha...
But Mirza Awajana Khadamullah, which the Bayani sources demonize as the Sabun Furush, a soap seller, he, in his own tract, when he breaks from Abbas Effendi Abdul Baha, and actually also from Mirza Muhammad Ali, eventually says very outright that this whole thing was actually conceived between himself and Baha'u'llah, that there was that these stories are actually not true, and that he was the original author of many of these epistles, not just at the early period, but also in the later period.
So you believe that the authors of jealousy, could be felt and smelled.
Look, this is so obvious, and you can analyze this so easily. Here is Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri. He's the eldest surviving member of the Nuri household. His father was a great courtier. They owned all this land, all this money. He's eminent. He's an aristocrat. All of a sudden, his youngest brother, who was an orphan, who's been the stepbrother, the kind of the quirky brother of the family, is elevated to the most preeminent rank of this movement that he himself belongs to. Obviously, this man felt that, oh my God, my stature, my status, everything is under question, and I am obliged by my membership in this new faith to pay obeisance to my youngest brother, my quirky little nerdy brother. And this would do a number on the mind of a 19th century aristocrat, moneyed, landed, like Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri, who basically believed that the universe owed him something. And so it is natural that he would have the reactions that he did. And then when, by virtue of the command of the Prime Point, that Subh-i-Azal conceal himself at all costs, and even going so far as telling Subh-i-Azal that you must keep the faith, that you must do your job, even if there's not a single person that believes in you. When this is the case, it is natural that someone as calculative, as power-hungry as Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri was, where we have tons of testimony from primary sources, from the Qajar period of what kind of a person he was, it is natural that when he found the opportunity that he would make the power grab. And we also see him calculating his way, manipulating his way over a decade into the position that he found himself in. To begin with, let's go back to the assassination attempt on Nasir ad-Din Shah. All of the Qajar histories, but more especially the family histories of the Nuri household itself, beginning with Ammeh, beginning with Azia Khanum, say that Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri was the mastermind of the assassination attempt of Nasir ad-Din Shah. Not Sheikh Azim Torshizi, but Baha'u'llah was the mastermind. And there is an anecdote that Badia Nuri relates in her review of Malak Khosravi's book that is quite poignant, and that is that Baha'u'llah had intimated in Takur before leaving for Tehran to Subh-i-Azal that he had a mind to assassinate Nasir ad-Din Shah, and that this was being talked about. Subh-i-Azal had actually tried to dissuade his brother from going. And just remember, at that point, Subh-i-Azal is the mirror of the Bayan. He's the preeminent leader. He is the return of the Bab in the station of mirrorhood at that point. Baha'u'llah basically grimaced and left immediately and made his way from Takur Nur to back to Tehran. And it was as a result of this that we had the events that happened that then scattered the Babi community that was left in Iran at that point out of Iran and into Iraq. So even at that very early point, there was already this friction, this tension between Subh-i-Azal and Baha'u'llah, even though the instructions from the Bab to Baha'u'llah at the time were quite explicit. His role was very much known. Now, let's go to the question of the promised one of the Bayan, Man Yusrullah, right? According not only to the text of the Persian Bayan and the Arabic Bayan, but the epistles that Primal Point sent to various individuals when queried about the following resurrection after the Bayan, the Bab is very explicit that he is not anticipating an imminent an imminent coming of a messianic figure at all, right? That the bayan needs to go through a term like all of the other faiths that have come in the past, such as Islam, Christianity, Judaism, etc., and that the tree of the bayan must grow, and once the fruits of the bayan have sprouted, then it is time for its gardener or the owner of the tree to come and pick the fruits. This is the imagery that is used in the bayan. And in the Persian bayan, he is very explicit. He says, sometime between Qiyas and Mustaghas. So 1511 and 2001. Now, interestingly enough, it is in Subh-i-Azal's own epistle, the Kitab al-Wasiyah, where there's actually an anticipation of imminence of the zuhur of Man Yasrullah. If, for example, Subh-i-Azal in this epistle anticipates his possible death, and he tells these witnesses of the bayan that after me, that if I die, then after me, sometime after me, there will be the zuhur of Man Yasrullah. So it's Subh-i-Azal himself who is anticipating an imminent paruja on the condition that he doesn't survive. Okay? But,
That's right. That's right.
On the condition that he doesn't survive. Nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that Subh-i-Azal survived. Subh-i-Azal survived until 1912, nearly 20 years after the death of Baha'ullah. And also that the Bab did not anticipate another zuhur. Whatever these Baha'i sources say, they often take, for example, one particular phrase out of the Arabic bayan, where the Bab mentions, you will attain all good ba'dahin, after a while, where the abjad notation of this is 144, and they do what they call a ayik beker in Kabbalah, in the gematria, where they reduce 144 to a single digit, and that becomes 9. And this is their justification that Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri is the promised one of the bayan. And it's just, this is nonsense, another piece of nonsense. Another justification that they use is the title Baha itself, because in the Persian bayan, the Bab says, whoever puts your attention towards the order or the Nazm al-Baha, right? But the Nazm al-Baha in the bayan has a very specific denotation. It is talking about, the theophanies of God. It is not talking specifically even about a person, although it can be inferred that what he's talking about in terms of the Nazm al-Baha and the fact that the title Baha accords to the Qa'im, okay, which is Man Yasrullah in the bayan, but also Subh-i-Azal in the epistles following the bayan, right?
And Mr. Azal, of tones of those reliable resources that you mentioned, I'm going to point out to one, which says at the end of the first year in Baghdad, the Babi leaders administered a very severe, rebuke to Baha for his misconduct.
That's right.
And therefore he became very angry, and he got quite sore at them and left Baghdad in the night, telling no one, not even his own family, where he was going. For 2 years, he lived as a dervish, in the Kurdish mountain in northern Iraq by the name of Dervish Muhammad Khan. Finally, Subh-i-Azal discovered his whereabouts and wrote to him to return. Baha obeyed, wrote a letter of regret, a letter of repentance, to his brother, and came back to Baghdad in the spring of 1856. Referring to his brother as the supreme leader or Mastar Amr. But now the Baha'i interpreted quite differently, saying that this supreme authority or Mastar Amr is no one but God. What do you
but
think of that?
in the Babi conception of, in the Babi theophanology, God at that point was embodied. There is a theophany of a person, and that theophany of a person is none other than Mirza Yahya Nuri, Subh-i-Azal, the morning and dawn of pre-eternity. This is the Babi worldview. This is not, I mean, these people can spin it however they want. Baha'ullah was a Babi at that point. So if he is addressing an audience, and specifically, since that epistle, the Khalu'iyyah, as it's called, it is a treatise addressed to the Afnan family, the family of the Bab that was left. And the very same family, by the way, that completely shunned him during the ministry, there was those 6 tumultuous years until his martyrdom. All of a sudden, in these late 1850s, following the murder of Mirza Asadullah Dayan, begin to communicate with Baghdad, and particularly with Baha'ullah, and Subh-i-Azal tells him, to respond to these people, and he does. And it is an interesting treatise. I mean, the Baha'is basically talk off the Kitab-i-Iran like it is it is something on the level of the Quran.
That's my next point.
And
Because as you know, Mr. Azal, being a peace-loving, a contemplative, a gentle soul, I'm talking about Subh-i-Azal, Baha'ullah, saw him incapable of self-assertion, willing to leave the direction of affairs, in the hands of himself, a man of much more resolute and ambitious character, who thus gradually became, the prominent figure and moving spirit, of the cause, as he pretended. The only book of importance which he wrote while in Baghdad was the Persian Iran, as you just mentioned, which in its English translation by Shoghi Effendi is entitled The Book
of
Certitude. Exactly. This book was composed about 1862.
That's right.
I believe.
Yep.
For one of, the maternal uncles of the point, who was still a Muslim, it was first called Khal Azam, or uncles, right?
Yeah.
Risale Khal. And later, after the revision made in Edirne or Eka, it was renamed Iran. The chief purpose of the Iran was to prove that, apparently the point was a major manifestation of God.
That's right.
But there was something lurking behind the whole story, Literature of the material in this book is original, for Baha'u'llah merely repeats and elaborates the doctrines already, thought by Shaykhis and the point himself.
I'll even go.
The book is full of, traditions and doctrines, nothing new and novel about the book.
That's right. Look,
what's the importance of this book?
Well, the importance of this book is what the Baha'is claim about it, and I've read many manuscript versions of this work, and there, some of these seem to change from one generation to the next. The fact is that as a istidlaliyeh, a kind of a proof of the cause of the Bab by a eminent Babi of the time, it is a relatively okay piece of work. I mean, it is not the Fusus al-Hikam, it is not the Quran, it is not the Hikmat al-Ishraq of Suhrawardi, it is not even from within the genre of istidlaliyun works, whether Muslim or even Babi istidlaliyun works, which are quite many, it is, I wouldn't call it substandard, but I wouldn't call it, the best ever written either. Now, Shoghi Effendi claims the Kitab-i-Iran as the completion of the Bayan, which is just absolutely hysterically funny from where I sit.
That's right.
Because it doesn't occupy, first of all, as a work, it doesn't really, address itself to that at all. but the bayan is supposed to reveal further ordinances. The Kitab-i-Iran obviously doesn't do that. It's a istidlaliyeh. It's not a book of ahkam. But this is what Shoghi Effendi has claimed about it. This is what the Baha'is take of it, and that is their evidence that, look, the Bab left the bayan unfinished, so Man Yasarullah could finish it, and so Man Yasarullah came in the form of Baha'ullah, and this is the Kitab-i-Iran. And this is just one of the many ridiculous and straw man, red herring arguments that the Baha'is have established for over a century to establish themselves and their own quite tenuous legitimacy, which is non-existent from my point of view completely. But this is what they say about this work. There are istidlaliyun by other bayanis, and these are very interesting works. I have several of these. These works are actually, I think, should be examined by other scholars. They don't address themselves at the time to any kind of a schism that was happening. They address themselves completely to the cause of the Bab and the veracity thereof. And these works deserve, I think, further study.
Have you ever read this book yourself?
Kitab-i-Iran?
Kitab-i-Iran?
Absolutely. Like I said, I've read it in multiple manuscripts. Yeah.
And so you believe there is nothing significant or precious about this book?
Not really, no. I mean, and I don't say this out of any bias. I mean, just remember, these were the books that in my childhood were being presented as, the be-all and end-all, the summum bonum of all religious texts. And, I have read this. Began obviously reading it first in the English translation of Shoghi Effendi, didn't get much out of it, and once I got older.
And as you said, Shoghi Effendi fabricated and manipulated so many, original and early texts of the Baha'is, right?
Yeah, and so what is the value? I mean, as a historical relic, as a piece of historical relic, historical literature, absolutely, people should read it. Especially because it has exercised such an important role in the self-identity and the carving of that identity by the Baha'is. People should absolutely read this book. But whether it is the greatest piece of religious literature, especially that came out of Bābism, that is quite a laughable proposition, particularly given that during this very time you have quite a number of treatises by Subh-i-Azal, one of whom actually translated in one manuscript version is called Akhlaq al-Ruhaniyun, the ethics of the spiritually minded, which is a treatise on suluk from the point of view of ethics. This is a very important work. There are multiple other works. Some of the works by the witnesses of the Bayan of the time that have survived. These bear, attention. So, also with some of his other works of that same period, such as the Hafwadi và Chahar Wadi, the seven valleys and the four valleys. The seven valleys of Baha'u'llah is basically a verbatim rendition of the seven valleys of Attar minus the narrative. His four valleys is basically a rendition of Mullah Sadra's four journeys of the soul minus the complex metaphysics.
Exactly.
Iterations or summaries. So whether these are the greatest texts ever written. For a manifestation of God that isn't to be superseded for 500,000 years, this is quite weak material that this manifestation is putting out there. And once we get into the 1870s with this Kitab-i-Aqdas, I mean, this book is just from start to finish laughable, primarily because it is just a rehash, a totally whitewashed and, badly rehashed and badly washed version of the ordinances of the Bayan, but minus the really great stuff that the Bayan actually put. For example, the Bayan conceives a world or a order that is eco-socialist, and that occurs in the 11th gate of the 9th unity of the Bayan, both the Persian and the Arabic Bayan, where the point prohibits a Bayani order from buying or selling the four elements, right? Well, obviously, when we get to the Kitab-i-Aqdas, this is gone, and Baha'u'llah firmly sides with the Anglo-Saxon capitalist world order, because it completely buys into their notion of private property, particularly in the section of the hudud, the punishments, where he talks about a thief being branded, etc. Well, none of this exists. This doesn't exist in the Bayan because the conception of the Bayan leans in the direction of a form of ecologically and environmental socialism, right? The Baha'is don't have that at all. They are firmly on the side of the capitalist world order.
Capital. And Mr. Azal, many of your writings, you say that we have, and we are actually in position of Subh-i-Azal's account of Baha's sudden, flight to Soleimania. According to Subh-i-Azal himself, in his epistle addressed from Edirne to, the Mutawalli Bashi of Qom, Subh-i-Azal states that, having witnessed the malevolent purpose of his brother Baha'ullah, Mirza Musa, and Mirza Muhammad Ghuli, he separated himself from them, and lived by himself. He says, quote, when my brother Hussein, i.e. Mirza Hussein Ali Baha, Subh-i-Azal goes on, quote, realized that I would not purpose his own, fancy in his desire to be the one to be followed and to become among men given to self-indulgence. He was away without my permission. He would not return aside from his lust. Move to compassion through the lamentation of his women folk and the pleading of his son. I dispatched 2 messengers and brought him back to Baghdad. I invested him, Subh-i-Azal adds, with the mantle of guidance, appointed him to act for me, and commanded all to follow him in my cause at my behest, as I had found him at the time to have become a lover of God, and to have turned aside from being of the people void of God's grace. But little by little, Mr. Azal, I myself believe, little by little, Baha started, waxing high, desiring to devour, and biting his brother,
Sure.
Because it seems that Subh-i-Azal was watchful. He was very careful and watchful. He did not want him, to be exposed in public,
Look,
as much as
let's put it.
Pardoned him for God.
Yeah, let's put it this way. This is coming from the family sources, from Subh-i-Azal himself, from the other Bayanis of that era, especially the witnesses of the Bayan. Subh-i-Azal, defended Baha'ullah. Why? Number one, because he was his elder brother. According to Badian, all the way until the Edirne period, Subh-i-Azal always affectionately addressed Baha'ullah as Agha Dadash. The master brother, Agha Dadash. But during the period of Baghdad, especially in the period when Baha'u'llah then comes to Baghdad from Iran, he finds himself very in short order in a controversy with some of the other witnesses of the Bayan, namely Isfahani and also to some degree Naraghi. And that is because rumors regarding his recantation of the Bab in the presence of Mirza Khan Nuri had reached the ears of these witnesses of the Bayan. And so they accused Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri of apostasy in that period.
Right.
And Naraghi actually underscores this, and also there is kind of indications about this in both Qahir and Siraj, but especially this is underscored by Ayati in I believe in the first volume of his Kashf al-Ilm, that Baha'u'llah had effectively, now whether this was a policy of taqiyya on his part or not, is a question that is, up for debate. We can even grant him the possibility that he was exercising taqiyya, he was exercising the discipline of the arcane, and as it was his right to do. Nevertheless, when he came to Baghdad, he was explicitly accused by these witnesses of the Bayan of apostasy. Now, why these witnesses of the Bayan would go out of the way to make this accusation is an interesting situation, primarily because Baha'u'llah was the sole and the most preeminent caretaker and guardian of Subh-i-Azal, and nobody came through to Subh-i-Azal except through Baha'u'llah. Yet these witnesses of the Bayan knew this, completely appreciated the situation, completely understood the fact that the Bab had sent this epistle to Baha'u'llah, telling him about his duties towards his younger brother in the mirror of the Bayan. Yet they gave themselves this opportunity to attack him, and it was as a result of this that Baha'u'llah then left Baghdad and went to Sulaymania. Now, we can grant that this whole story about Sulaymania is true. I don't believe it exactly in the way that the Baha'is have told the story. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it transpired as exactly as they say it did. The fact is that when Baha'u'llah reemerges 24 months later or less from the Iraqi Kurdistan mountains, he reemerges because Mirza Asadullah Dayan, one of the scribes appointed by the Primal Pun, by the Bab himself, be both a scribe to his own writing and also that of Subh-i-Azal, had a complete, what I could only characterize as a sort of psychotic conniption. And that is because he began to publicly denounce the Bab, to burn the works of the Bab in his possession that had been left with Dayan for safekeeping, and denouncing the Bab while simultaneously making claims of his own to some form of supremacy. And this is a very, very weird situation, but the textual material is there. What the Baha'is have characterized about the situation of Dayan is completely not what happened. Dayan I believe, had a psychological meltdown of some description. And who knows what the reasons for this was, but one of the witnesses of the Bayan, that Subh-i-Azal had appointed a Qazvini by one of the Qazvinis, he became one of Dayan's believers. Then Dayan began to issue challenges to Subh-i-Azal, and Subh-i-Azal wrote an epistle to him. This is not the Kitab al-Mustaqiz yet. An epistle that, actually recently the original text of which, a scan of which has come into my hands, and it is in the handwriting of Subh-i-Azal himself, where Subh-i-Azal basically declares Dayan a kafir and a munafiq, by virtue of the fact that he had denounced and renounced the Bab himself. This leads to Dayan coming to Baghdad. As a result of this whole tumult is the reason why Subh-i-Azal got Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri Baha'u'llah to come back to Baghdad. And it is only a short time, maybe even a matter of weeks, after the return of Baha'u'llah back to Baghdad, that Dayan appears in Baghdad. And according to all of the earliest sources, not the sources that the Baha'is have put out there, but the earliest sources say that one of the servants of Baha'u'llah himself, a Mirza Muhammad Mazandarani, was the person who drowned Asadullah Dayan in the Tigris River, who basically murdered him.
Mr. Azal, would you please tell us something about Baha's next move? Because when the rupture took place, when the rupture took place between Subh-i-Azal and Baha, actually Subh-i-Azal stopped to provide, Baha stopped to provide food to Subh-i-Azal's family, for their sentence in a bid to starve Subh-i-Azal into submission through pressure.
This is an Adana. This is we're getting a little bit too ahead of ourselves. In Baghdad itself, perhaps
I'm specifically talking about Surah Haykal. What's it all about?
The Surah Haykal is not a Baghdad era work, though. This is the thing. The Baha'is claim that this is one of the writings that Baha'u'llah quote-unquote revealed in the Baghdad period. It is actually from the Edirne period. It is from nearly a decade afterwards. So, let's bracket that for a minute. But there are other works of that period that he did wrote that we can vouch for. Like, for example, the Rash Amma. This is a kind of a mystical work by Baha'u'llah. This was written, he doesn't make any explicit claims. There is a treatise, a very short treatise on the Huruf Muqatta'at, the disconnected letters of the Quran. That is from the Baghdad period. And
again, no explicit
claim, no nothing. There is another treatise that Juan Cole actually translated into English. I can't remember the name of this off the top of my head right now, but where he basically claims to pay he pays obeisance explicitly to Subh-i-Azal, the Bab, and Quddus. And in the section where Wajhullah, which is the title of Subh-i-Azal, is mentioned, Juan Cole has actually failed to note or cite that section as being referable to Subh-i-Azal. This kind of very, woolly silence politics of the Baha'is and their fellow travelers around these very, unequivocal facts of history, just incredibly annoying. But yet this is what they do, that even with the explicit text from that era, there's an attempt to whitewash, who was what, who occupied what station, what was going on, who was allied with who, and what the actual situation was, and who the preeminent leader was, and who was recognized by the majority of the Babi community of the time as being the preeminent leader of the Bayani faith.
Of the Bayani, right?
Now, once,
and Mr.
hold on, let me finish. This is a very, very important
sure.
one. How Baha'u'llah then managed is to basically take over the machinery of this faith completely by virtue of his position after he returns from Soleimani is as follows. A certain Musa Jawahiri, a Babi of considerable wealth, a merchant, and also an alim, apparently dies, but bequeaths his entire inheritance to Baha'u'llah personally. Right? Up until that point, even though there was a lot of what they call Sah Imam, or the Khums, that the Babis were required to send to the Master Am at the time, Subh-i-Azal, the Nuri household itself and Baha'u'llah personally was still not in the same position that they had been in Iran before they had been kicked out by the Qajars. With the death of this Musa Jawahiri, apparently a considerable amount of wealth comes into the possession of Baha'u'llah himself. Simultaneously to this, this is the period where we find Mirza Malcolm Khan Gorji, the eminent Georgian or Armenian, whatever, but the founder of the Faramosh Khanate, the very first independent Armenian Masonic lodge, who makes a visit to Baghdad and begins a very fruitful relationship with Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri. And on the top of that, you have another eminent figure from that period, this time a Parsi by the name of Manakji Limji Hataria, who was actually, as far as we understand, he was not only the most eminent Parsi in India at the time, but he was also a Grand Master of the Lodge of Bombay. And he also travels to Baghdad and establishes a relationship with Baha'u'llah as well. Both of these individuals were obviously and unequivocally agents of the British Empire. And at the time, both the Tsarist Russians as well as the British were looking through every avenue and every movement, everything, to basically use as a tool to destabilize or otherwise control the various decaying empires and dynasties in that region. Subh-i-Azal appears to have not paid these gentlemen any heed at the time, and wasn't interested in anything coming from that general direction, because his task was very specific. His task was to basically to preserve and transcribe the works of the Bab, and also to compose his own works, and to basically preserve and continue and build the community that had been decimated in Iran only a decade before. But Baha'u'llah had other ideas.
Very interesting.
Baha'u'llah had other ideas.
Exactly. And Mr. Azal, finally, my final question for you. Let me divide it into two parts. First, do you believe these two persons, namely Mirza Malcolm Khan and this Indian guy that you mentioned, Malekji, are they, the persons who prompted and, provoked, Baha'u'llah to make his claim in public?
I think they were instrumental. They were definitely linchpins of that, because just remember, at that point he had come into a considerable amount of wealth. He had also eliminated a very significant political threat in the form of Mirza Asadullah Dayan. So there was really nothing now standing in his way other than his brother himself, Subh-i-Azal.
And did Mirza Aghajan Kashani, Khadimullah, did he have any sort of contribution,
well, according to himself, he did.
Prompting Baha?
According to Qadamullah himself, in that little tract that he wrote, kind of a radiyeh of both brothers, he actually did. He said that, he was instrumental in at least the literary production side of this, whereas the actual maneuvering itself was obviously Baha himself. But the literary production element of it was apparently, according to Qadamullah, orchestrated by himself. Yes.
Right. And my final, my second and final question. Do tell us a little bit about the famous Bābism incident. What's it all about? What happened in Bābism, and what is addressed as a very significant incident? Let's say a milestone of the Baha'is, and and a pivotal point during all these periods.
Well, Badiye Miraturi's account believes that nothing happened. And even a lot of the Bayani accounts like Naraghi's and Qahir Siraj, etc., there doesn't appear to have had anything had actually occurred on that date.
Would you please first elaborate what is
this is the apparent
what is saying by the Baha'i about what happened?
Okay, the Baha'is believe in April of 1863, just on the eve of the departure of Mirza Hussain Ali Baha and Ṣubḥ-i-Azal and the Babis from Baghdad, that Baha'u'llah made his declaration openly, or at least semi-openly to his partisans in this garden in Baghdad, which they have dubbed the Wahid Azal, or this garden of Najib Pasha, apparently one of the Turkish pashas or governors of Baghdad at the time. According to Badiye Merati Nuri, a kinswoman, close kinswoman, nothing actually happened other than the fact that the night before, Mirza Aghajan Khadimullah had actually went and cut flowers from what they call the Golem Muhammadi, and laid it at the doorstep of Baha'u'llah, and the next morning had basically marched out to the assembled Babis, claiming that the flowers had prostrated themselves of Mirza Hussain Ali Baha, and I tend to believe, and I tend to believe
this is what is said by the Baha'is.
Well, this is not what the Baha'is say. The Baha'is believe that it was a kind of like a Mount of Olives kind of moment, from the Gospels, where Jesus and his apostles are assembled, and Jesus finally reveals himself as the Messiah. This is the way that the Baha'is have kind of characterized this whole event. But like I said, all of these earliest sources believe that nothing actually transpired. That then post facto, after the fact, in the process of them constructing the narrative of the creed, then ex post facto, they basically retroactively carved and created an event in that April 1863.
So it's some sort of afterthought, right?
Yeah, it's an afterthought.
It was some sort of
after the fact. All of a sudden, an event was projected into the past of having occurred where no such event had occurred at all. And also remember, in the Istanbul and Edirne periods, Baha'u'llah initially made the claim to Husseyniyat, which he had also been making, more in a much more hidden way in Baghdad itself. But in Istanbul and then Edirne, he was making not the claim to being Man Yasrullah, the promised one of the Bayan, but to being the return of Imam Hussein. And Subh-i-Azal had actually not even responded to that claim of Baha'u'llah's and continued to associate with his brother as if nothing was going on. And officially, at least, on paper, up until probably around, early or probably mid-1866 or so, Baha'u'llah was still officially the official custodian and guardian of Subh-i-Azal, and he was still technically his right-hand man. It is only in that period where suddenly Baha'u'llah decides, to then cast off the Husseyniyat claim and goes for the gold, as it were, and declares himself to be the promised one of the Bayan himself. And it was at that point then that the big schism, what the Bayani sources have characterized as the Fitneh Seylan, the direful mischief, occurs. And there was a lot of bloodshed, mainly by the Baha'is against the Bayanis. Hassan Ershad has quite incorrectly and quite dishonestly in several of his programs been claiming that the blood was shed on both sides. In fact, that is not the case. None of the sources and none of the documentation says that. All of the blood that was shed by the Baha'is against the resistors to the claims of Baha'u'llah. And these resistors not only reside in Edirne, but also the two brothers that I mentioned previously, in fact, that Tahir and Siraj, almost immediately after they penned their own detraction or denunciation of Baha'u'llah, two independent treatises, each by each brother, they were murdered, one after another in Baghdad.
And Mr. Azal, when you actually ponder often, this sorts of historical inaccuracies, particularly among the Muslim historians and scholars, including, Mr. Ershad or, a certain, Mr. Musavi or some other, Muslim contemporary historians, as opposed to their claims, as opposed to what has been written, Subh-i-Azal has never ever made any claim of manifestation.
Subh-i-Azal only claimed what the Bab claimed for him. Subh-i-Azal's station was as a minor manifestation, according to the Bab himself, not a abrogator of the Bayan. Like I mentioned in the last podcast.
Exactly, I'm talking about Man Yasrullah, who shall got manifest.
This is not a claim, not a specific claim that Subh-i-Azal made himself. It is a claim, however, that Haji Mirza Jani does indeed make in Kitab al-Nuqtat al-Kaf on Subh-i-Azal's behalf. That is attributable to the confusion of that chronicle history at the time, which also proves that this text was not a manufacture by the Bayanis or the Azalis. Subh-i-Azal's claim was completely within the theophenomenological context of the teachings of the Bayan and nothing beyond it, as the mirror of the primal point, who was the primal point's equal in the station of mirrorhood. And that is all. However, like I mentioned also previously, one of the titles that the primal point, the Bab, calls Subh-i-Azal by is Haykal Mustaqas, the temple or talisman of the one invoked, Mustaqas itself being the one of the ciphers, one of the reference to the promised one of the Bayan.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Azal, for giving us so many insightful information. Hopefully, we'll be continuing, in this vein, inshallah, and we will with you, on the next podcast of this series. Thank you very much indeed again, and God bless you, Godspeed you.